Morning, everybody. Thank you all for getting up so early and joining us for one of the first panels of this World Economic Forum meeting of the new champions. We're here this morning to discuss Asia's shifting alliances. With us are Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group, who's over here from the US, representing the Chinese viewpoint and its many nuances. We have Feng, who's the head of the China Center for Collaborative Studies at the South China Sea at Nanjing University. And we have a former member of the South Korean Parliament, Jeong-Woo, who also chairs the World Economic Forum's Korean Global Agenda Committee. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn. We obviously all read a lot about the South China Sea. We all know it's a flashpoint, and it's an area of growing tension. What, from the US perspective, I'll start and move on the outside and move inwards, are the biggest risks, do you think, and what would be the best case scenario for how this could play out over the next few years?
Well, the biggest risks are pretty obvious. I mean, this is a part of the world, South China Sea, that, I mean, basically half of the world's population lives in a very small circle around it. It's absolutely critical in terms of the global supply chain and as a choke point, which means that if you were to have real security tensions, the impact is immediate and global. And so, you know, my concerns, given the fact that the Chinese, the Americans, and America's allies in the regions have very different perspectives about the way that territorial disputes should be resolved, should be managed, and clearly those tensions are not being either addressed or being improved over time, then all you need is a big accident, and suddenly the markets go nuts. But I'll tell you, I am hopeful. And I'm hopeful because unlike so many things, unlike, for example, the British referendum, in the case of the South China Sea, and particularly the rise of China, every person in Washington that cares about America's trajectory thinks about the rise of China, the concerns they have about the rise of China. There's no surprises here. In China, the view of the United States is the same. They are thinking strategically. They do understand how important the stakes are. And most importantly, the sides actually respect each other. The Americans look at Russia and we say, this is a country in decline. We don't really care if they're upset by us, and we're going to punish them. We're going to isolate them. The Americans would never treat the Chinese with that level of contempt. And the Chinese don't treat the Americans that way either. So despite the fact that tensions are rising, the Chinese are building their artificial islands in the region, the Americans are increasing their military presence in the region, I actually think there's quite a bit of resilience built into this great power alliance that ultimately is what creates a level of order in the system.
Feng, before we started this panel, you were saying that if you read the Western media, you get a slightly distorted picture of the level of tensions. Can you sort of expand upon that? How do you actually see the tensions in reality versus perhaps what we might be reading in the papers?
Of course, I think there existing a wide range of misperceptions in Western media coverage to the South China Sea. For example, almost all the media coverage just definitely point to the China's some sort of overclaiming the South China Sea's water area. Then mostly international media say, look at China's claim. It's almost the one just claim the 85% of the water areas of the South China Sea, or almost the entire water area of South China Sea. But I have to say it's totally wrong. So Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman repeatedly said again, so China's claim to South China Sea is the maritime feature and its adjacent water areas. So China has no claim over some sort of the entire water area framed by the U-shaped line. Another point I think probably is also relating to the lingering, lasting misperception. That means the China's islands construction and reclamation probably just a signal of China's intended dominance of South China Sea. I also have to say it's wrong. China's policy of South China Sea is not perfect and somehow is problematic. But it doesn't mean the South China Sea smooth is some sort of a bigger indicator. Beijing wants just strategically expanding and also squeezing the US, bullying our Asian neighbor, and also pushing for the China's dominance. I have to say my country, China, is very diversified. We have a rationalist, we have a populist, we have a realist, we have the internationalists. So the China's argument of South China Sea, unbelievably pluralistic. But the problem is the mainstream in this country remain very stable and very, very expected. So what we want claim of the South China Sea, on the one hand, is fortify China's sovereign claim. On the other hand, is also expand some sort of China's presence to the maritime areas in a reasonable way. So then there's no such a thing, for example, China intend to claim the entire South China Sea, or China want to take it as some sort of strategic battlefield and challenge the US. The power disparity between China and the US remain very, very big and stable. So I don't think China will be at any position to challenge the US, and particularly US-Japan allies. It's absolutely overwhelmed China in all the terms.
So, Jeong-Woo, from the Korean perspective, we were just talking ahead of time about this decision in The Hague that's coming up. And what the Philippines brought a case against China in 2013 about their actions in the South China Sea. From North Asia, when you're looking at the situation in Southeast Asia, what is it that really worries you?
Well, actually, we are waiting for the kind of decision by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in the coming weeks. But the problem to us is most East Asian countries are depending on the navigation of the freedom of navigation in their trade, depending on those kind of freedom of navigation. But this kind of South China Sea issues seems to be projected as a dispute between the United States and China. I think that is wrong. For the last couple of weeks, U.S. has played a kind of broad-scale maritime drill in the eastern part of the Philippines, participated by 2 aircraft carriers, more than 300,000 active servicemen in the region for that period of time. And another disturbing fact is Chinese government is also made it clear before the final decision by the court, China is not abiding by that kind of the court arbitration decision. I think this is two disturbing issues. U.S. military flexing its muscles in the region in a broader scale. And China is made it clear in advance that she is not abiding by the decision by the court. So I'm really concerned about these issues, territorial and maritime issues, seems to be projected to all Asian countries, the dispute between the US and China.
We know that this decision in The Hague is not binding. It's simply a sort of indication, perhaps it's a news point, but I mean, Ian, from your perspective, does it matter?
Well, I mean, it matters in the court of international opinion, of course, and all of the countries here are trying to make that matter. I mean, the Chinese government has been looking far and wide to find countries that will support their position on the South China Sea, and they've found a few. I mean, Laos, the Central African Republic, I mean, you know, sort of small and far-flung dictatorships that are economically dominated by the Chinese government, and so they give them the political word. But keep in mind, you know, China didn't used to have the same level of support on Taiwan, but as China became economically more important, they were able to, over time, pick off 1, 2, then 10, then 20, then 30 countries. Before you know it, you know, Taiwan basically has lost the majority of its international influence, and I think the China strategy in the South China Sea makes a lot of sense in that regard. Look, this is a gradualist, incrementalist game, and the one place that I'd have a small disagreement is that I do believe that America's fairly active, robust military role in the region and its willingness to escalate actually makes this more incremental. The Chinese are risk averse here. They're more than happy to shake the branches and see if any fruit falls off. But they don't want conflict. They don't want fundamental conflict that subverts their economic relations with the South China Sea littoral states, and they also don't want it with the United States. I would argue if the US were to suddenly truly abdicate in the region, things would become more unstable. And there is a danger of that because, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is, one would argue, the most important US initiative, not only in the region, but in recent years, probably globally. If Trump wins in 2016, it's gone. If Hillary wins, it's not assured. And you've got countries like Vietnam, whose orientation towards the US, its economic reform base, is driven by TPP. If that falls apart, you know, their ability to continue to hedge between the Chinese economically but the Americans militarily will be undermined. So look, what are the big risks here? One big risk is that the United States suddenly really turns inward. The other big risk is that the Chinese, if we start to see here that the economic deterioration continues, starts playing a more nationalist card. Right now, we're sitting in the middle of 2016. We don't really worry about either of those things, but we have to understand they're both proximate dangers.
Yeah. Ian mentioned about the economic kind of aspect of this kind of maritime, very conventional issues. I mentioned earlier that this kind of South China Sea issues seems to be projected to other Asian countries as dispute between US and China. Another issues you raised of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership issues. Well, there's general consensus that is a kind of the issues the US is initiating and wants to expand the kind of free trade, the regime in the region, versus RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, led and initiated by China. Most Asian countries perceive that kind of TPP versus RCEP, that shouldn't be that kind of the structure, but setting aside a conventional dispute on territorial, historical, and maritime issues, even on trade and economic issues are concerned, most Asian countries should face that kind of reality. That is not a matter of choice between TPP or RCEP, but that will be kind of affected by this kind of conventional security military kind of disputes.
Yeah, I think South China Sea tension, of course, one of the potential risk we can imagine is it will cause some sort of increasing spill of geo-economic situation or landscape in East Asia. Then we will see, for example, if the US keep just dispatching a very, very huge combative group of the aircraft carrier and then sailing near the China's maritime features, of course it will scare the Chinese. If we accidentally just react in a way very unreasonable and emotional, then there will be some sort of the military conflict, and it will be sparking the military tension. That will be a big undermining and a blow to the China-US economic relations. And also adversary spillover effects will be sweeping through the region. So that's a very scary scenario. But the problem is when we discuss some sort of international arbitration ruling, how it matters. Of course it matters at all, but only under the condition that all the players, all the party concerns could truly and realistically sitting down, talking, and how to put this international ruling into some sort of real effects. On that circumstances, I think the things also will be eased down, not just between China and the Philippines, and also between China and US. But if any players usually we will take this arbitration ruling as some sort of a new way to force China into the corner. Of course, Beijing will backlash. So then I agree with Ian. So how the international jurisdiction could be functioning in the region, in the dispute settlement, it depends a lot on how gradualist approach that all parties could embark on. But the most important thing is diplomatically and strategically, all players should just calm down rather than just betting on a single international ruling could just, bring about a solution at all.
I mean, certainly sitting in Beijing, when you read a lot about the South China Sea in the Western press, you see it on the Chinese news, but I've not heard a single businessman mention it, ever. I mean, there are two completely parallel dialogues here, and the economic dialogue seems to go along without even looking at these tensions. But it does seem that if you did have an incident, we could suddenly see that people having to take these questions a lot more seriously.
Well, again, it's important for everyone to continue to focus, because when things go badly, they can go very badly. And you think about the Japan-China relationship, which right now feels pretty good. Japanese investment in China is doing well. Chinese tourists go into Japan, record numbers. But you go back from 2012 to 2014, when Abe referred to Xi Jinping as Voldemort, when Japanese foreign direct investment was off 50%, when the Chinese were banning Japanese cars, and when everyone else was actually coming into China at that point. That was quite a dangerous period, and in part it was because both sides felt a little insecure. There were some demonstrations, right? As much right now, if you look across the South China Sea, you see countries and leaders that have enough political capital that they can focus on the longer-term strategic economic gains, and that's even true with someone like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, who everyone said was going to be a new Trump. But if you look at the way he governed as a mayor, absolutely was focused on economic pragmatism, and that team has been appointed. So I feel quite comfortable there with Joko in Indonesia. Same thing is true, but that can change. And that's all I'm saying is we happen to be, compared to the rest of the world, this part of the world happens to be reasonably well and strongly governed. We have decent leaders. The world has no leadership today, but we have reasonably decent leaders here. And as long as that continues to be true, I'm actually not very worried that even an accident, where you had, God forbid, a fishing trawler go down, some people get killed, even an air incident, let's say, between the Americans and the Chinese, I think could be managed reasonably well in a way that between Russia and Turkey destroyed their economic relationship, because those leaders are just in a very different place.
Yep, I think the view is very similar to Ian. So then this region, not just well-governed, but this region also usually is very amazingly hacked by some sort of a long-term economic realism, and even, in other words, we say it's also diplomatic pragmatism. So for example, a lot of people complain China probably is mighty in the nationalism. But if you ask the individual Chinese question, so what really matters for you, they always will answer you the better off. There's some sort of better life. So then I think that China is also in some sort of interesting transformation, but the leading thought, whatever we see some sort of such a simmering pluralism in China, but the leading view is always better of life, mean everything. So from this point, I think plus with the Ian's notion of the decent leadership, I think stake may not be as high as we expect, even regarding the South China Sea tension. But one thing is very worrisome. That means we also see some sort of such a very daunting nationalistic sentiments. Such sentiments, not just embracing China, but also embracing Japan, Korean, and other regional partners. So if those sentiments will not be well managed, probably there will be some sort of reaction caused this incidental blooding, the effects. On the other hand, we also see the number of the flashpoints ranging from the Taiwan issue, South China, North Korea's nuclearization, and even some sort of, we say now, is impressing its operational stability in the Western Pacific. So given all such some sort of a deepened complexity, it's not easy to manage some sort of such a flashpoint and keep control some sort of such a big potential, distracting and even very disruptive effect.
I generally agree with Ian's that we don't have to too much concern about the future in the region, especially because of Southeast Asia kind of issues. I generally agree. Intra-regional trade and investment in the region, Asia, Southeast Asia, is steadily increasing. And global growth rate is very sound comparing all other parts of the world. But we should remind that China and the United States, each country which is supposed to be a leader in the region and as well as in the global scene, should take their own homework. Regarding the maritime issues, United States should ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And China, on the South China Sea issues, well, it seems to kind of sailing solo on that issues by kind of claiming and arguing that no outside disturbance on South China's security and stability. But China should choose that is a matter of national pride or core interest, or just would better be project herself as a kind of peace-loving and respect the international norm as a kind of the big power. But beyond that kind of South China Sea issues, there are many positive issues. China is very aggressively kind of launching a one belt, one road kind of development initiative. Yeah. That is the maritime part of that kind of one belt, one road project is something to do with the kind of maritime disputes, as well as AIIB, Asian Infra Investment kind of bank, initiated by China. That is all kind of groundwork for us, Asian countries, or some South Asian countries, to predict the kind of better positive opportunities in business and economic areas.
So I will come back to One Belt, One Road and AIIB, which are positive developments. I mean, we certainly saw a number of countries that worry about tensions in the South China Sea all rush to sign up to AIIB. But on this question of vacuums of leadership, I mean, what happened with Brexit isn't a failure of democracy, it was a failure of leadership. It was an internal party squabble which was thrown into the public arena for no good reason at all, and which has now caused, global market ructions. We're all worried about Trump. If we do have a Trump victory, if there is a lack of leadership or an unprecedented kind of leadership in the US, what does that mean for this region?
Well, what it means is much more unilateralism. I think we can see that under even President Obama, who takes a more 21st century approach on the limits of American power globally, restraint on American power, that a lot of US allies around the world look in the US and they're not as sure that the American commitments are going to remain what they have been. And they'll say that on security, they'll say that on promotion of global trade, but they'll even say it on values. And if Trump were to become president, it's not just uncertainty, there'd be more certainty that the relationship is going to fundamentally change. So I do think that on the one hand, tactically, the Chinese would be advantaged by a Trump administration because they'd have just a lot more room to basically tell countries, look, you can't rely on the US, so we're going to do what we want to. But here's what's interesting. When you travel around the world and you talk to different foreign ministers, they'll all tell you, that they like Hillary Clinton, and they've said that for years, that they're comfortable with Hillary as president. The exception has been China. The Chinese over the last 6, 7, 8 years have consistently said, we don't want Hillary because of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because she's the architect of the pivot to Asia. They consider her a hawk in the region. They don't like her. You talk to the Chinese leadership now, they say, we want Hillary. And I think that this is an incredibly important point. The Russians still want Trump, because the Russians are fundamentally revisionist. They want a weak United States. They want to divide and conquer. The Chinese perspective is more strategic. It's more confident. And it's also, we need a stronger United States. We need a world order that's more stable. I think you could argue that the US and the Chinese, from different sides, are actually moving towards more consensus about the global environment. That doesn't mean that you're going to have a G2. You're not, because the Chinese won't provide that leadership and the Americans increasingly don't want to either. But it does avoid conflict. And so I think the very fact that the Chinese themselves are worried about the potential of a Trump administration is something that should give us cause for hope geopolitically in this region and more broadly.
Yep. I think what's China's favor between Trump and Hillary Clinton? Yes, Ian provided some sort of a very, very convincing analysis, but it's more conceivable to understand what kind of the Chinese favor. I think whoever will be next U.S. president, to my understanding, what we welcome, what we favor, is a real one who could be more predictable and more trustable. So no matter who he is or who she is, hawkish, hardlining, isolationist, we don't care. I don't think the American president will be getting tough, will be getting soft forever on Henry China factor. We also don't think that Hillary Clinton will be consistently, being very, very hawkish against China, because she also knows China very, very well. So, but if the new president really presents uncertainty, as you mentioned, or in other words, unpredictability, that will be a problem, because we couldn't follow up with his or her policy choice. Then we probably also have to switch the course and forcing us to readapt to. Then that kind of unpredictability really will create some sort of lot of, we say, such a chunky and creaming, some sort of mismatch. That will be potential of a danger.
I mean, just coming a further question here. If we were to see a Trump victory, that's obviously the biggest fear. No one actually knows what he stands for, because he changes his mind every 5 seconds.
Including him, right?
Yeah. So I think we can confidently say he'd be unpredictable. There's certainly been some talk in the Western press that would be good for China. But it seems that you're saying, actually, no, that's not what the Chinese want.
I think, first of all, it's a totally unrealistic thinking that President Donald Trump will dramatically, restructure America's foreign policy and truly bring the isolationism over to the Washington, D.C. No, we don't see that way. President Trump, if he wins, probably will just bring the change, but the change will be that far, that big, to, as I say, re-project the U.S. in completely differently international strategy. We never believe that. But on the other hand, Trump also point the fingers to the China's nose, say, hey, you steal the job, you robbing us some sort of financial dominance, or some sort of such a very inflammatory words. So it's also got the Chinese very, very frightened, because we don't know what kind of Trump we have to deal with. What will be some sort of fresh point hitting the both sides? There will be war of trade. There will be some sort of world trade driven growing tension of the political wrestling. Yeah, it's some sort of unpredictable, probably more unpredictable. So that's why I have to say quite a few Chinese will see Trump's prospect also will profit to the Chinese.
And I just think this is an extraordinarily positive development. We need to really unpack this, right? Which is, the Chinese are saying, the leadership is saying, they would rather have someone who would expand things like the THAAD military, the missile system in South Korea, that would expand US bases in Darwin, Australia, someone that would expand US military presence and activities across the South China Sea, someone that would take a much more aggressive military stance. They would much rather that than someone who has said that they would actually get rid of the security umbrella with the South Koreans and the Japanese, reduce American presence if those allies aren't going to pay, precisely because that person would be so much more unpredictable for stability. I think that's right. I think it's appropriate, and it shows both maturity and confidence and a long-term desire for stability on the part of the Chinese government that we should really welcome. The question is, will we still get that after Xi Jinping? Because someone who has consolidated so much power individually does create a much more uncertain transition themselves. And the same question you're now asking about the United States in 2017, many people will be asking about China in the future. And we need to recognize that too.
Yeah, but I think one of the very deeply rooted worry on the Chinese side is the new administration will tend to overinterpret the China's strategic intention. Then will be overreact some sort of the China's move in South China Sea. I think that yes, China somehow, with regard to the foreign policy, is struggling for some sort of good benefit and good neighborhood, and some sort of China's being in a better profile coming after the China's interest. We see such a struggling will linger. But the problem is how U.S. react. So I think one of the biggest stakes we can also have in mind regarding the South China Sea is U.S. will be overreacting, then probably China will overstretching. So that kind of action and a reaction cycle probably will be very badly mislead our future relations.
So I don't want to define Mr. Trump as unpredictable, but we prefer the next U.S. president should be reliable and should definitely understanding of Asia value and significance of Asia in the future of the United States, not only for the whole world. So deep understanding and balanced understanding of Asia, and hopefully that the next U.S. president is very kind of supportive of Asian initiative to engage with multilateral security structural framework in Asia. So that is a missing part differently from Europe. Europe has initiated OSCE, including the NATO, former NATO members. But strangely enough, there is no such a kind of multilateral security framework structure to maintain the peace and stability in the region. This is a kind of Asia paradox. There is economically growing, but no such a kind of multilateral security framework to keep stability in the region. So next U.S. president should be much more kind of supportive, but engaged with a kind of dialogue initiated by Asia on the future of security in the region.
So we're obviously seeing, regardless of who becomes the US president, we are seeing the US roll back from this position of international leadership. There's certainly less domestic willingness to take that role. China is stepping up into a level of greater international leadership. From the Korean perspective, and then I'll go back round, I mean, what does that mean, and what are your sort of biggest hopes from China, and what worries you about it?
What kind of expectation of China from Korea to the future step of China is surely be much more kind of active and aggressive to launch a One Belt, One Road, but hopefully to the beginning of the kind of project coming from the Korean Peninsula, from the east to the west, as well as kind of more practical approach of AIIB, how to maintain the kind of international investment bank based on the global standard by inviting all member and other regional countries participating in the decision-making process. But also China will play a much more in security area, much more kind of active and pragmatic to kind of deter any kind of security threat from North Korea. This is a common headache. There is a common understanding that China still is the most influential country to maintain or control the any kind of disturbances out of North Korea. The risk is, the concern is, China would better be kind of free herself out of kind of obsession. China should be a kind of regional hegemon or global hegemon in the near future.
But I don't worry that way because I think look at China. What makes the greatest difference between the U.S. and China? U.S. is mature power. China is not. China is still in transition domestically. So then, before we can successfully just running through some sort of a very amazing domestic transformation, I don't think China will be at any position to compete with U.S. even for a regional dominance. So we should be very cool-headed about this very, strategic constraint. But the problem is, what kind of a China will be more respected? It's also the question similarly to the region and to the world as well. China's lending power. We want to get the two things, economic growth and international contribution meeting each other. But so far, it's also some sort of a very, controversial journey. But in the coming days, China still will be struggling for that regard. But the key push from the region, from the Korean, US, will be partly positive, but partly negative. But because the power competition always overshadowing the regional economic integration. But the problem is to how big the space could be left for US and China to cooperate while also competing. So that kind of cooperation and competition complex probably will be a leading lens to restrain the future skyline of our relations as well as the region.
Well, I mean, I think if you ask me over the next 5 to 10 years, am I more worried about that continued trajectory or the potential of a hiccup from China? It's overwhelmingly the latter. I think that China's continued rise, assuming it occurs, they become cleanly the world's most important economy. Right now, they're already by far the most important trade partner for every country in this region compared to the United States. And so what I think their power will, as long as they continue to be stable, their power will continue to be expressed primarily economically. And what we'll see happening is that one by one, you'll see countries in this region start to shift their position in a way that's more friendly to the Chinese, as the Chinese just have so much more economic influence that it undermines their political sovereignty. And so, you look at Indonesia, and even though it's becoming harder and harder to paper over the tensions militarily because the Chinese themselves are escalating, the Indonesians just put out, I think it was their first big military strategy document, white paper, in like 5 years. And for domestic consumption, for the generals in the local language, they had maps that showed like the Indonesian claims on islands. But internationally, in Chinese and English, they didn't have any of that, right? That shows a level of we don't want to upset a China that we really need economically, right? That has influence, has the ability to hurt us. And I also think that this region benefits from the fact that there's a lot of information. The dominant economic players in the private sector, which of course has a lot of public sector influence in most of these countries, are of course themselves ethnically Chinese. In Indonesia, that's a little bit less true in the sense that even though they're Chinese, they integrate more domestically. But certainly in the Philippines, you see that, right? Certainly in Malaysia, you see that across the broader region. That's important, right? Because that gives the Chinese a much better sense of when and how they can press effectively, what levers are more useful to get the outcome that they ultimately want, which is, of course, to be a much more dominant power in the region. How is the United States going to respond to that? Well, it depends on the allies. America can do a lot more in a region where the allies are saying, we want a lot more America. And right now, you see that in Australia and the Philippines and Vietnam. In 10 years, I would be stunned if those governments are, even if the United States, with a Hillary Clinton presidency and maybe another one, are playing a relatively strong role and articulates its strategy in a reasonably clean and clear way, I would still say that most allies in the region will be clamoring for a little less America in 10 years' time, and that would be on the basis of China's continued economic rise. The real issue is what happens if that rise suddenly takes a big hit. Because then the Chinese are acting out of insecurity, then they need to raise the nationalist flag, they need to play to a much more populist orientation. Final point for me on this. Let's keep in mind, if we were to have democratic elections in China today, which I know is hard to imagine, would we get a leadership that is more oriented or less oriented towards an unbounded nationalism, towards restraint or action in the region that would upset the apple cart? I think clearly you'd get something that would be much more dangerous in the region. We need to recognize that.
Yeah, I think, so a question for everybody about slowing Chinese growth, and how that links to this question, this drum-banging nationalism that we've seen in Russia, that we're seeing across Europe, that's completely destabilized the UK economy now. How do you worry about those two things and their links, Zhufeng?
Basically, I think China's economic slowdown probably is not a completely bad news, because we need some sort of rethinking of such a growth strategy. If we always keep the economy growing rapidly, but at the huge cost of degradation of the environment and some sort of worse air pollution, then just a lot of Chinese feel very, very unhappy. So then I have to say the news of the slowdown of the economic growth so far coming at a very critical moment. On the one hand, we should increasing China's domestic efficiency in, for example, consuming all the energies and mineral materials. But on the other hand, the government as well as the people, they now is very wisely and very quickly just prioritize some sort of green development. I think that will be a very crucial new components of China's economic identities and some sort of development strategy. So it's welcome. It's also now winning a lot of domestic applause. But the problem is, yes, we need to keep up some sort of reasonable growth rate. So now there's a growing debate, for example, in what way? What kind of imperative we can just figure out to keep the economy moving relatively rapid path. So then it's a very debatable and also very questionable question. So then my view is this. So when China's economic growth rate is a little bit dropping, it's good. So it's a domestic implication, as I say, is positive. But the problem is, it's also a formidable challenge. In the coming 2 decades, what kind of such a reasonable growth rate could be very promisingly sustained? Of course, it's a challenge not for Chinese government, but also for Chinese society. But anyway, that some sort of slowdown of the economic growth will translate it into some sort of a new driver behind the nationalism or nationalist sentiments? No, I don't think so. When people, for example, just get the more reasonable and the more objective, looking at the China's model, China's some sort of economic development pattern, that kind of the Chinese really getting more knowledgeable about the relations between China and the world. On the other hand, look at today's China. Chinese international access also unbelievably tremendous and massive. So the country is increasingly porous to the outside. So then I don't think the nationalism will be some sort of a leading concern. But what is very concerning to me is how the government could reasonably capitalize on Chinese people's patriotism to consolidate the power base. It's not an easy job.
So, slower economic growth of China is bad news to everyone in the world, every country in the world. But hopefully that we would better at the same time to develop or activate some kind of mechanism of multilateral dialogue to give a check and balance of the future path of China, even in economic, financial, business areas. Meaning is China's One Belt, One Road development strategy and AIIB might be a very good mechanism for China to demonstrate herself. She is a leading and reliable party to lead a common growth in the region and as a whole. And on the other hand, as a kind of check and balance mechanism for China is going dominantly kind of economic future of Asia as well. So that's my thought on the kind of Chinese immediate choice.
Right. Let's keep in mind that these countries in the region, most of them would much rather have continued Chinese 10% growth than One Belt, One Road. I mean, the Australians, after the longest run of unhindered economic growth for all the OECD, suddenly put in a recession because the Chinese just weren't buying the way they used to. And I think that the level of dependence on China also comes with a level of much greater volatility for these own countries, because China is not a mature country and it is going through this extraordinary economic transformation. So that's going to unnerve a lot of these governments. It's going to make the region just less economically stable as a consequence of what China itself is going through. So we need to recognize that. And that can also lead to domestic hostility that comes from some of these countries when what they thought they could get, were guaranteed, suddenly they were not. But I do think you're absolutely right that so far, China's slowdown has been a very welcome thing, because it forces the Chinese to engage in a transformation process that they really need to. But that's because so far the slowdown has been incremental and manageable on the part of the Chinese government. There are signs that may not be able to continue for so long. And if it gets to the point that we start to see political instability, we get to the point that it starts to really inhibit Chinese reform because they think that it's becoming dangerous for them to do so. The bubble gets bigger in that regard, bad loans get worse. Then I think you would start to see it play out in terms of nationalism more broadly in the region. And for me, I guess I'm more concerned about that than I am about the implications of a Trump presidency. If you ask me to kind of wait out which would be more significant for the region, I really think China's slowdown leads to nationalist backlash is the one that I'd be worried about.
So I do want to give the audience a little bit of time to ask questions. So wave your hands because I've got the light shining in my eyes. At the front.
Hi, this is Sjoerd Das. Sjoerd Das from the Dutch Financial Daily. I have a question. After the Brexit last week, we know that China has been emphasizing the golden era of relations with the UK. A question for Mr. Bremmer and Mr. Zhu. How do you think these relations will basically develop over time? Does this change something to the relationship? And do you think they're going to move more towards other European countries in order to get that bridge to Europe?
I've never been a big fan of the UK-Beijing relationship. I think when the UK said, we're going to join the AIIB, in fact, we're going to join first because we want to be your best friend in the region, that smacked of desperation. And what we know is that when the Chinese are very good on business terms. When they sense you're desperate, they push you a lot harder in terms of the commercial outcomes. I think that was tactical weakness on the part of the Brits. I also think that the Chinese orient towards strategic strength more broadly, and they spend a lot more time in Germany than the UK because the Germans matter a lot more. Well, the UK has just made themselves much less relevant, and so I suspect if we were to do a data analysis on how much time the Chinese spend in the next 5 years in the UK compared to Germany, and compare that to the time that they have been spending in the last 5 years, you'll see that this was not a good decision for the UK, right? I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, one more words. I think from the beginning, the naming of our relations as some sort of a golden era, I think is completely overblown. Yes, economically we are complementing each other, but look at the Hong Kong issue, look at South China Sea issue. Then a lot of China media also got the London not matching up that kind of a naming. But my view is that from the beginning, so you can't just imagine the China-UK relations could just run in a way, just in that kind of imaginary manner. So then let's get back to some sort of realistic thinking. On the one hand, I don't think any decision to leave in the Union, European Union by Great Britain will lead into any disruption to our relations. Then probably it will set the UK free, a little bit free, to have some sort of better and closer economic interactions with China. But on the other hand, I think what kind of implication, what kind of earthquake, we say some sort of impact to Chinese from your just a recent referendum is we have to re-examine what Europe is. So in what way such a new vote could just echo some sort of, it's a moving forward of globalization, or it's a truly back down of a globalization. So in broad sense, that kind of impact, it seemed to me, is very positive, because it will deepen Chinese thinking of some sort of a way, say, not just economically intertwined the world between the two sides, but what kind of a role China should just play. Then what kind of the Chinese past taking could be reconsidered in a way very positive. So I see a lot of merits.
More questions? Yes, Paul?
Professor, about the South China Sea and the Nine-Dash Line, Professor Zhu has argued before that the Chinese government needs to, the world must recognize China's historical legitimacy in its claims on the Nine-Dash Line. But on the other hand, the Chinese government must also not claim sovereign rights over the waters within the Nine-Dash Line, nor should China claim EEZ rights over the waters in the Nine-Dash Line. Instead, you argued for a lower level of legal status for these waters within the Nine-Dash Line for the Chinese government. That seems to be a novel notion. I wonder, question for Mr. Bremmer and Professor Zhu, do you think realistically this could be the grounds for some compromise between China and countries in the region on South China Sea?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say there's no official clarification of what the Nine-Dash Line, at the end, it is. So then, yes, there's some sort of ambiguity. But for me, it makes a lot of sense. China's claim to the Nine-Dash Line friend water area is not easy. It's not territorial water. But what it is, if you look at the China's official claims very carefully, then we will find a very important notion that always just emerging on the Chinese side. I mean the historical rights. So, but what's the historical rights exactly, and how it could be specified? There's some sort of indecision at all. But anyway, I think the historical rights just definitely meaning Nine-Dash Line framework. Nine-Dash Line friend water area is some sort of a traditional fishing ground. China can fish there. Chinese can fish there. But on the other hand, probably we have a very good, privilege of navigation and the passage. Then probably to some sort of areas, then we probably have some sort of, we say, the mandate to drill, the seabed resources. But all such rights could be just, could not be just, we say, achieved before we can have a successful negotiation with our neighbors. So then, anyway, I think China's push on use supply is soft. I have to say that. It's very exact and very adequate. But the problem is, the real solution is negotiation. It could be bilateral, probably somehow it's multilateral. But anyway, such a diplomatic means will finalize what kind of China's claim is, and also clarify what sort of the settlement it could be in South China Sea. So then I don't think any preset condition could be laid out on the ground for the successful diplomatic negotiation.
Can I comment on one comment on the Brexit? So the lesson to me personally is Brexit reminds the Asian countries that European continent's stability is based on their efforts to get integration. So Asian countries are reaching and have been trying to make an effort to reach a certain level of integration. Answer is no. So I really hope that the United States and China should not be an obstacle for Asian countries to get further integrations in search of the stability and prosperity. They would better join to promote integration among Asian countries. Mm-hmm. That keeps the stability and co-prosperity not only in Asia, but also guarantees the stability in the whole world.
I mean, look, far be it from the United States to, over the long term, interfere with regional level integration of many different architectures. And I think the Americans' decision not to join the AIB and not to get Japan to join it was a big mistake. I think that, you know, the more the merrier, as long as everybody's involved. I agree with you on TPP and RCEP as well. But I think that there's another lesson to be drawn from Brexit, which is much more dangerous, which is that decentralization is a very serious trend. You see it in the United States. It's not Washington, it's municipalities, it's states. You see it in Europe. It's, you know, sort of not the European levels. It's not Brussels. It's nationalities, and even within that, it's Scotland. It's England. That the Chinese can't take that. Right? They're not willing to think about decentralization. And yet, when I look back on Soviet reform, you know, everybody knows about perestroika, the Chinese want that. Everybody knows about glasnost, the Chinese didn't want that. But there's a third piece, which was decentralization. And I don't think that's being addressed right now. It needs to be. And I think that this is an argument that we're going to see a lot more of, and it's going to be much more dangerous and potentially fragmenting for a lot of countries in this part of the world.
We have time for one last question. Maybe at the back.
As we can see, Japanese government has attended in the affairs of South Sea more than ever before. So what do you think? How it will affect the situations in South Sea? Thank you.
South Sea?
The area of
South China Sea.
South China Sea, yeah.
Japan's role?
Japanese government shows more appearance in the affairs of South China Sea.
钓鱼岛钓鱼深刻 Island conflict and how it will affect South China Sea issue.
Yeah, South China, and so how it will affect the situations in this area.
Okay, thanks. Very good question. I think first of all, the Chinese and Japanese truly still stuck on some sort of such unsettled territorial disputes. It's another fresh point in the Asian Pacific. That means the territorial dispute of Diaoyu Senkaku Island. Then we will see recent months, then there will be some sort of new signal, the tension escalating. Then the Japan condemned China of some sort of selling the warship into the adjacent water areas. But China protested, so then it's the territory China legally claimed. So then that kind of move is totally legitimate. So then I see the Diaoyu Senkaku disputes truly remain a very bad case to keep Tokyo and Beijing apart. If both sides couldn't just creatively and productively just get things a little bit improved, and also put in both sides closer over the disputes, then we will see that strategic implication for China-Japan relations, which have always been very, very troublesome and disruptive. So it's a very big concerning matter. But how the Japan it will be affect the South China Sea tension as the, of course, unresolved South China Sea, Eastern China Sea territorial disputes truly emboldening the Japanese to tighten up a balancing China policy. So then Japan become a very high profile, address their concern with South China Sea, and then Japan also become some patrolling warship provider for Philippines and Vietnamese, and then Japan also become a bigger, outcry on any multilateral international occasion, just keeping China under the pressure. So then, yes, I see the implication is very unhealthy. Of course, it's geopolitically, it's also very expectably, distressing the Tokyo-Beijing relations. So then, two things is different, but it's inherently linked with each other. So I really hope China, and Japan could sitting down and have a very serious discussion of some sort of such unresolved territorial disputes, as well as some sort of a regional strategic vision. What kind of things could just hitting both Tokyo and Beijing together?
We just to wrap up, if I could get all of the panelists to say, what are the final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with? There's obviously a lot of consensus, but.
So today's theme, Asia's shifting alliance, will be developed inevitably under the kind of power rivalries between the United States and China. Mm-hmm. I want to share with you and the two countries by referring old Chinese wise man Gongzi, too much is as bad as too little. Meaning is keeping prudence is the best way to co-prosperity and kind of coexistence and stability in the region.
I think the shifting alliance in Asia Pacific is very essentially to the Americans' advantage, because such an alliance system centering around the U.S. is intensifying. It has some sort of a very expectable and a stable, strategic prospect in the region. Following in the eyes of Chinese, how we can respond. I have to say it's a big factor to keep the China's power, not just on the check, but it's also a very, very important reality to get to China, work on some sort of power temptation. I'm very honest. But the problem is, if the U.S. use this some sort of, we say, overwhelmingly powerful alliance system, just pitting the region totally against China, I don't think that will be strategically wise and healthy. So then, on the one hand, I really hope U.S. now could just more able to just leverage on China, but on the other hand, how to smartly and wisely just using this alliance asset. But most important thing is don't at the cost of a sustained regional prosperity. I think that remains some sort of a test for U.S.
I think one thing that is pretty notable about this panel is, despite the fact that there is a clear geopolitical transition underway, there's actually a fair amount of consensus here, and there would be if we invited, I think, a bunch of similarly minded people from some of the Southeast Asian states themselves. That would not be true in almost any other part of the world right now. Mm-hmm. And again, I focus on the fact that transition is happening gradually. It's happening in an environment of a lot of information. There's a lot at stake. These are not marginal stakes. It's an issue that's not just critical for security, but is intensely important for everyone's economies. So high stakes, gradual transition, stable political leadership, those are actually ingredients for reasonable transitions. The question that we all have here is, will any of those things no longer be available for the mix over the coming years? And I think we prodded at some of those. That's where this is going to become a more challenging panel going forward.
Very good.
So thank you all very much for joining us this morning. And you can all feel very lucky that you're living in Asia, if you are.